Welcome back to Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today, as we remember the 72nd anniversary of 1945 liberation of the death camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau, to remember what took place on that day. If we do not remember, it will happen again. The word Holocaust, from the Greek words holos, meaning whole, and kostos, meaning burned, was historically used to describe a sacrificial offering burnt on the altar. Since 1945, the word has taken on a new and horrible meaning: the mass murder of some 6 million European Jews, as well as members of some other persecuted groups, such as gypsies and homosexuals, by the German Nazi regime during the Second World War. To the anti-Semitic Nazi leader Adolf Hitler, Jews were an inferior race, an alien threat to German racial purity and community. After years of Nazi rule in Germany, during which Jews were consistently persecuted, Hitler's final solution, now known as the Holocaust, came to fruition under the covering of World War, with mass-killing centers constructed in the concentration camps of occupied Poland. Anti-Semitism in Europe did not begin with Adolf Hitler. Though use of the term itself dates only to the 1870s, there is evidence of hostility toward Jews long before the Holocaust, even as far back as the ancient world, when Roman authorities destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and forced the Jews to leave their homeland. The Enlightenment, during the 17th and 18th centuries, emphasized religious toleration, and in the 19th century, Napoleon and other European rulers enacted legislation that ended long-standing restrictions on Jews. Anti-Semitic feeling endured, however, in many cases taking on a racial character rather than a religious one. Even in the early 21st century, the legacy of the Holocaust endures. Swiss governments and banking institutions have in recent years acknowledged their complicity with the Nazis and established funds to aid Holocaust survivors and other victims of human rights abuses, genocide, or other catastrophes. The roots of Hitler's particular virulent brand of anti-Semitism are unclear. Born in Austria in 1889, he served in the German army during World War I. Like many anti-Semites in Germany, he blamed the Jews for the country's defeat in 1918. Soon after the war ended, Hitler joined the National German Workers' Party, which became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known to English speakers as the Nazis. While in prison for treason for his role in the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, Hitler wrote the memoir and propaganda tract Mein Kampf, means My Struggle, in which he predicted a general European war that would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Hitler was obsessed with the idea of superiority of the pure German race, which he called Aryan, and with the need for Lebensraum, or living space, for that race to expand. In the decade after he was released from prison, Hitler took advantage of the weakness of his rivals to enhance his party's status and rise from obscurity to power. On January 20th, 1933, he was named Chancellor of Germany. After President Paul von Hindenburg's death in 1934, Hitler anointed himself as Führer, becoming Germany's supreme leader. The twin goals of racial purity and spatial expansion were the core of Hitler's worldview, and from 1933 onward they would combine to form the driving force behind his foreign and domestic policy. At first, the Nazis reserved their harshest persecution for political opponents, such as communist or social democrats. The first official concentration camp opened at Dachau near Munich in March 1933, and many of the first prisoners sent there were communists. Like the network of concentration camps that followed, becoming the killing grounds of the Holocaust, Dachau was under the control of Heinrich Himmler, head of the elite Nazi Guard, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and later chief of the German police. By July 1933, German concentration camps held some 27,000 people in protective custody. Huge Nazi rallies and symbolic acts such as the public burning of books by Jews, communists, liberals, and foreigners helped drive home the desired message of party strength. In 1933, Jews in Germany numbered around 525,000, or only 1% of the total German population. During the next 6 years, Nazis undertook an Aryanization of Germany, dismissing non-Aryans from civil service, liquidating Jewish-owned businesses and stripping Jewish lawyers and doctors of their clients. Under the Nuremberg laws of 1935, anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was considered a Jew, while those with 2 Jewish grandparents were designated Mischlinge, half-breeds. Under the Nuremberg laws, Jews became routine targets for stigmatization and persecution. This culminated in Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938, when German synagogues were burned and windows in Jewish shops were smashed. Some 100 Jews were killed and 1,000 more arrested. From 1933 to 1939, hundreds of thousands of Jews who were able to leave Germany did, while those who remained lived in a constant state of uncertainty and fear. In September 1939, the German army occupied the western half of Poland. German police soon forced tens of thousands of Polish Jews from their homes and into ghettos, giving their confiscated properties to ethnic Germans, non-Jews outside of Germany who identified as German, Germans from the Reich, or Polish Gentiles. Surrounded by high walls and barbed wire, the Jewish ghettos in Poland functioned like captive city-states governed by Jewish councils. In addition to widespread unemployment, poverty, and hunger, overpopulation made the ghettos breeding grounds for disease such as typhus. Meanwhile, beginning in the fall of 1939, Nazi officials selected around 70,000 Germans institutionalized for mental illness or disabilities to be gassed to death in the so-called euthanasia program. After prominent religious leaders protested, Hitler put an end to the program in August 1941, though killings of the disabled continued in secrecy, and by 1945, some 275,000 people deemed handicapped from all over Europe had been killed. In hindsight, it seems clear that the euthanasia program functioned as a pilot for the Holocaust. Throughout the spring and summer of 1940, the German army expanded Hitler's empire in Europe, conquering Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Beginning in 1941, Jews from all over the continent, as well as hundreds of thousands of European gypsies, were transported to Polish ghettos. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked a new level of brutality and warfare. Mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen would murder more than 500,000 Soviet Jews and others, usually by shooting, over the course of the German occupation. A memorandum dated July 31, 1941, from Hitler's top commander Hermann Göring to Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the SD, the security service of the SS, referred to the need for Endlösung, final solution to the Jewish question. Beginning in September 1941, every person designated as a Jew in German-held territory was marked with a yellow star, making them open targets. Tens of thousands were soon being deported to Polish ghettos and German-occupied cities in the USSR. Since June 1941, experiments with mass-killing methods have been ongoing at the concentration camps of Auschwitz near Krakow. That August, 500 officials gassed 500 Soviet POWs to death with the pesticide Zyklon B. The SS soon placed a huge order for the gas with the German Pest Control Company, and an ominous indicator of the coming Holocaust. Beginning in late 1941, the Germans began mass transport from the ghettos in Poland to the concentration camps, starting with those people viewed as the least useful, the sick, the old, the weak, and the very young. The first mass gassings began at the camp of Belzec near Lublin on March 17, 1942. 5 more mass killing centers were built at camps in occupied Poland, including Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and the largest of all, Auschwitz-Birkenau. From 1942 to 1945, Jews were deported to the camps from all over Europe, including German-controlled territory as well as those countries allied with Germany. The heaviest deportations took place during the summer and fall of 1942, when more than 300,000 people were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto alone. Though the Nazis tried to keep operation of camps secret, the scale of the killing made this virtually impossible. Eyewitnesses brought reports of Nazi atrocities in Poland to the Allied governments, who were harshly criticized after the war for their failure to respond or to publicize news of the mass slaughter. This lack of action was likely most due to the Allied focus on winning the war at hand, but also as a result of the general incomprehension with which news of the Holocaust was met, and the denial and disbelief that such atrocities could be occurring on such a scale. At Auschwitz alone, more than 2 million people were murdered in a process resembling a large-scale industrial operation. A large population of Jewish and non-Jewish inmates worked in the labor camp there. Though only Jews were gassed, thousands of others died of starvation or disease. During the summer of 1944, even as the events of D-Day, June 6, 1944, and a Soviet offensive the same month spelled the beginning of the end for Germany in the war, a large proportion of Hungary's Jewish population was deported to Auschwitz, and as many as 12,000 Jews were killed every day. By the spring of 1945, German leadership was dissolving amid internal dissent, with Göring and Himmler both seeking to distance themselves from Hitler and take power. In his last will and political testament, dictated in a German bunker that April 29th, Hitler blamed the war on international Jewry and its helpers and urged the German leaders and people to follow the strict observance of the racial laws and with merciless resistance against the universal poisoners of all people, the Jews. The following day, he committed suicide. Germany's formal surrender in World War II came barely a week later on May 8, 1945. German forces had begun evacuating many of the death camps in the fall of 1944, sending inmates under guard to march further from the advancing enemy's front line. These so-called death marches continued all the way up to the German surrender, resulting in the deaths of some 250,000 to 375,000 Jews. In his classic book Survival in Auschwitz, the Italian Jewish author Primo Levi describes his own state of mind, as well as that of his fellow inmates in Auschwitz on the day before Soviet troops arrived at the camp in January 1945. He says, "We lay in a world of death and phantoms. The last trace of civilization had vanished around and inside us. The work of bestial degradation, begun by the victorious Germans, had been carried to conclusion by the Germans in defeat. The wounds of the Holocaust, known in Hebrew as Shoah, or catastrophe, were slow to heal. Survivors of the camps found it nearly impossible to return home, as in many cases they had lost their families and been denounced by their non-Jewish neighbors. As a result, the late 1940s saw an unprecedented number of refugees, POWs, and other displaced populations moving across Europe. In an effort to punish the villains of the Holocaust, the Allies held the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946, which brought Nazi atrocities to horrifying life. Increasing pressure on the Allied powers to create a homeland for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust would lead to a mandate for the creation of Israel in 1948. Over the decades that followed, ordinary Germans struggled with the Holocaust's bitter legacy, as survivors and the families of victims sought restitution of wealth and property confiscated during the Nazi years. Beginning in 1953, the German government made payments to individual Jews and to the Jewish people as a way of acknowledging the German people's responsibility for the crimes committed in their name. The three words, "first they came," is a statement and poem written by Pastor Martin Niemöller, who lived from 1892 to 1984, about the cowardice of German intellectuals following the Nazis' rise to power and subsequent purging of their chosen targets, group after group. Many variations and adaptations in the spirit of the original have been published in the English language. It deals with the themes of persecution, guilt, and responsibilities. He is quoted as saying, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. The tragedy of the Holocaust is best stated as I list the countries and their losses. Austria, 50,000 Jews died. Belgium, 28,900 Jews died. Bohemia and Moravia, 78,150 Jews died. Denmark, 60 Jews died. Estonia, 2,000 Jews died. Finland, 7 Jews died. France, 77,320 Jews died. Germany, 141,500 Jews died. Greece, 67,000 Jews died. Hungary, 589,000 Jews died. Italy, 7,680 Jews died. Latvia, 71,500 Jews died. Lithuania, 143,000 Jews died. Luxembourg, 1,950 Jews died. Norway, 762 Jews died. Poland, 3 million Jews died. Romania, 287,000 Jews died. Slovakia, 71,000 Jews died. The Soviet Union, 1,100,000 Jews died. Yugoslavia, 63,300 Jews died. In addition, as many as 5 million non-Jews, people seen as enemy of the Third Reich, were also killed in the Holocaust, including communists, Romas, Serbs, Polish intelligence, political opponents, Renaissance fighters, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the physically and mentally disabled. There were 4 different kinds of camps. There were concentration camps, facilities established by the Nazis where civilians, mostly Jews, political prisoners, and sometimes prisoners of war were confined, typically under harsh conditions. The concentration camp system was organized and run by the SS under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler. Most concentration camps functioned as slave labor camps, where the inmates were forced to work to support the Nazi war effort. The second kind of camps were extermination camps, facilities established for the large-scale industrial murder, mostly of European Jews. All of the Nazi extermination camps were located in Poland. There was the Nacht- und Nebel camps. The Nazi Nacht- und Nebel camps' night and fog campaign resulted in the kidnapping and disappearing of political enemies of the states. These prisoners were not allowed any contact with family, so no one would ever know what happened to them. And there were transit camps, facilities where prisoners were gathered and detained prior to being deported to concentration camps or extermination camps. The extermination camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Poland, over 1 million Jews died. Belzec, Poland, 435,000 Jews died. Chelmno, 150,000 Jews died. Majdanek, 78,000 Jews died. Sobibor, 200,000 Jews died. Treblinka, 870,000 Jews died. In addition, there were major concentration camps. Dachau in Germany, 200,000 held, 32,000 died. Buchenwald in Germany, a labor camp, 250,000 held there, 56,000 died. Mauthausen, In Austria, a labor camp, 100,000 held, 30,000 Jews died. Dora Mittelbau, labor camp, 80,000 held, 20,000 deaths. Gross Rosen in Germany, which is now a part of Poland today. The labor camp and the Nachtruhnebel camps, 125,000 held, 40,000 died. Ravensbrück in Germany, a labor camp for women, 150,000 held, 90,000 deaths. Westerbroek, Netherlands, a transit camp, 102,000 Dutch Jews deported to extermination camps. Sachsenhausen, Germany, a labor camp, 200,000 held, 100,000 Jews died. Płaskow, Poland, 150,000 held, 9,000 deaths. It was from here that the German industrialist Oskar Schindler saved 1,200 Jews. Drancy in France, a transit camp, 70,000 French Jews deported to extermination camps. Theresienstadt, Germany, which is now a part of the Czech Republic today, was a transit camp and ghetto. 140,000 held, 35,000 Jews died. Stutthof in Poland, a labor camp, 110,000 held, 65,000 deaths. It was the first concentration camp built by Germans outside of Germany. Neuengamme, Germany, labor camp, 106,000 held, 43,000 deaths. Natzweiler Struthof in France, a labor camp, another Nachtruhnebel camp for political enemies, 40,000 held, 25,000 dead, the only German-built concentration camp in France. The Vichy France controlled all the others. And Jasenovac, Yugoslavia, which is part of Croatia today, a concentration camp, an extermination camp, 100,000 held, 100,000 deaths. I have been to Birkenau and Auschwitz, and in both those places, adjacent to each other, I took a group. We prayed over that camp. The images I saw that day will be forever indelibly emblazoned in my mind. I have been to Odessa and Kiev, following the trail of my own family. My own family shot at Babi Yar, my own family killed in the barracks in the fire in Odessa, my own family that fled from Galicia in 1904 after the first wave of the Cossack persecution of the Jews in southern Poland and western Ukraine. I've seen with my own eyes along the river in Budapest, where the shoes are lined up in bronze of those that were lined up on the riverbanks and shot. My family's names: Ehrenpreis, Stern, Yeeses, Jekis, Vovovich, all emblazoned in the annals of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. And I remember as a child, born in 1952, surrounded by languages, the languages of the Holocaust: Yiddish, Eastern European, a hybrid language of German and Hebrew. As my family spoke, I remember that as a young boy I was introduced to a very, very short woman with very odd shoes. Shoes that today would be considered out of the ordinary, not fashionable in any way. She must have been 4'11". Her name was Gisela in English, Gisela in the native tongue. Her last name was Yecies, Y-E-C-I-S, Gisela Yecies. She was my mother's first cousin. She watched her entire family, my family, her mother, her father, her aunts, her uncles, her brothers, and her sisters die at the hands of the Nazis. I remember as a child the discussions surrounding bringing her to America. It wasn't until I was older that I asked, what did bring her to America mean? And because after the war there were so many families who had lost all their family, they were placed in displaced person camps where they had no contact, no connection. And the governments of Europe, who felt responsible, who felt that they needed to help, began to reach out to America, and that's when my family was contacted that she was a cousin. My grandfather made it so that he could sponsor her and bring her to America. She had a very, very thick accent. But as a young girl, because she had been taught to sew, she was considered one of the best seamstresses, and so her life was spared because the officers of the SS would come to her to have her repair their uniforms. So while she was in service in a labor camp, to sew buttons back onto uniforms, to sew patches back onto uniforms, she witnessed one by one the slaughter of her family, the slaughter of my family. I made it a point to go to Kiev and Odessa because our family name, Aaron Price, is a name from Ukraine. And so I began to dig into the paperwork and the files and the records and found my family's records both in Kiev and in Odessa. I made 2 trips there to witness to the Holocaust survivors, a generation which is quickly passing away. Many I have personally led to faith in Messiah because they know that unless they walk with forgiveness, that they can never recover from the horrors of that experience. There are those in the world that would deny the Holocaust, that would deny the plight of my people, but the reality is that in 1938, there were 18 million Jews in the world. Here we are, almost 80 years later, and we are the only race of people in the world whose population has decreased. We have only recovered by approximately 1.5 to 2 million people. Therefore, we are still under the numbers that we existed in 1938. If we do not remember the Holocaust, it will happen again. And we see across the world an anti-Semitic rising, a spirit of Esau, if you will, a spirit of the Antichrist, the ones that would set themselves against the Jewish people, the nations of the world, the Gentile nations of the world, the 70 that would gather against to bring about Gog, Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39. We know that in that battle, 2/3 of the Jewish population is exterminated. It is anticipated by the time that that battle comes that the Jews will be restored to their ranks of approximately 18 million. So let us look at that remaining number of 6 million. That is the number of the Jews who died in the Holocaust. We see the same pattern in the Bible when we look at Pentecost, because the first Pentecost was 50 days after the Exodus and 3,000 Jews died. We know it was the day of the giving of the law written on tablets of stone. We know that it was met with smoke and billows of fire coming from Mount Sinai and a loud blast like a trumpet. We also know that 2,000 years later, 50 days after the resurrection, that Peter came down from the upper room, which was also filled with smoke and tongues of fire and a loud trumpet blast, and 3,000 were saved, for God's redemptive power was made perfect. That God would redeem the 3,000 lives who were lost, and God will redeem the 6 million who were lost. As I stood there in the barracks of Auschwitz, and I looked at the carvings in the barracks, on the bunk beds and on the ceilings, one thing was repeated more often than any other carving. And the words in Hebrew were, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You see, the rabbis led their people into the gas chambers, knowing that it would be the last breath that they would take on earth. He led them in a prayer of hope, a declaration that God was sovereign, that God was one, and declaring, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and declaring the majesty and the sovereignty of God even unto death. The rabbis knowing exactly what was going to take place. As I stood in that place in Auschwitz, I was overwhelmed by a sense of mourning, but also completely counter to that was a sense of hope that God would redeem those who are lost. Adolf Hitler was not a madman. He was just one more committed to his sin than the body of Christ was committed to the Lord as they sat quietly by while 6 million of my people met their death. Today, this day in history, marks the anniversary, the 72nd anniversary of the liberation of Birkenau and Auschwitz, the largest death camps, extermination camps in the history of mankind. The influence of Adolf Hitler was so great that the Shah of Iran renamed Persia to Iran. Iran in Arabic means Aryan. At the fall of the second Shah, Iran began their exterminations of those who became victims of ethnic cleansing to advance the Shiite agenda. The same spirit is in the world today. As hatred toward the Jews begins to grow, we know that Jesus prophesied about the sheep and the goats. We know that half of the body of Christ is going to take the mark of the beast, and that is the half that mistreated the Jews. Paul writes in Romans chapter 11 that God will continue in his kindness provided the Gentiles continue in their kindness to the Jews. The gift of salvation was given to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to envy, not to provoke Israel, but to provoke them to jealousy. And this half of the body of Christ that will take the mark of the beast are the very half today that engage in replacement theology, saying that the Jews no longer have the inheritance promised to them by God in Genesis 15. But yes, that this is the very thing that people are engrafted into, is this land promise, this covenant promise that was not conditional upon our performance, not conditional upon our acceptance or obedience to the law, not conditional upon our acceptance to Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, but only conditional upon the graciousness of God, who says, I will make an everlasting covenant with Abraham and his descendants. We serve a redemptive God a God who will restore what the locusts have eaten, to restore the Jews and Jerusalem, to restore Israel. But if we do not remember, if we do not memorialize this date and Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance, that comes about in the month of May, it will happen again, and the world's hands will again be stained with the blood of millions of Jews. The Holocaust was real. I have the names of every one of my family members that died. It is not one side of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It is not two sides of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It is 3.5 lined pages of the names of my family who perished in the largest genocide to ever hit the world. We must commit to never be silent again. If we do not remember, it will happen again. We'll be right back.